My ex-husband married his dream woman 3 weeks after our divorce was finalized. I didn't scream. I didn't call him. I didn't even cry. I just stared at the wedding photo on my screen and smiled. Because the moment I saw her face, I knew everything. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story travels. The courthouse stamp on our divorce papers was barely dry when he posted the announcement. Finally married the woman who makes me feel alive again. There they stood on the steps of a white country chapel somewhere outside Austin. He wore the same navy suit he'd worn to our son's graduation. She wore lace and innocence like a costume. But it wasn't the dress that caught my attention. It was her face. Soft smile. Tilted chin. The way she stood slightly behind him, but angled toward the camera like she belonged there. I had seen that face before. Not in a passing way. Not at a grocery store. Not in some distant memory. In my kitchen. 3 months before my husband asked for a divorce, he'd invited a colleague over for dinner. A bright young woman from his consulting firm. She called me ma'am. Complimented my lemon roast chicken. Told me she admired long marriages. I remember how she watched him while he talked. Not with respect. With calculation. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid. After 34 years of marriage, you don't suspect betrayal easily. You suspect stress. Midlife crisis. Burnout. You blame cholesterol, blood pressure, retirement anxiety. You don't blame a woman young enough to be your daughter. The night he told me he wanted a divorce, he didn't look angry. He looked relieved. I just need something different, he said, standing in our living room like a man announcing he'd switched cable providers. Different. That was the word. He didn't accuse me of anything. Didn't raise his voice. Didn't even pretend to be heartbroken. He just said we had grown apart. I slept in the guest room that night. The house felt unfamiliar. The walls held 34 years of memories, but suddenly none of them belonged to me. 2 weeks later, we were sitting across from each other in a quiet conference room signing papers. My attorney slid the documents toward me. His attorney kept checking his watch. I signed. I kept the house. He kept his retirement accounts and the lake property we bought 10 years ago. It felt fair. At least, that's what I told myself. When the divorce was finalized, he moved out the same afternoon. No hesitation. No lingering. Boxes already packed. That should have been my first clue. Normal endings are messy. They're filled with second thoughts and late-night phone calls. This one was efficient. Too efficient. When I saw the wedding photo 3 weeks later, something inside me didn't break. It aligned. Her hair was styled differently than the night she came to dinner. But the eyes were the same. Sharp. Observant. Patient. And then I noticed something else. The chapel in the background. It wasn't just outside Austin. It was on Lake Travis. Our lake property. The one he insisted on keeping. The one he said he needed for peace and reflection. I zoomed in on the photo. Behind them, just visible through the trees, was the dock we'd built together 12 summers ago. I had painted those railings myself. He hadn't just married quickly. He had planned this. Not after the divorce. Before it. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. For 34 years, I had been the steady one. The planner. The one who tracked expenses, scheduled doctor's appointments, remembered birthdays, balanced the checkbook. And now the pattern was becoming clear. The sudden business trips. The separate credit card he opened for consulting expenses. The nights he claimed to be working late at the lake house. She wasn't new. She was established. And that meant something else, too. Money had moved. Assets had shifted. Decisions had been made long before I was invited to sign my name at the bottom of a document. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the comments under his wedding post. Perfect couple. True love wins. So happy you found your soulmate. I didn't comment. I didn't block him. I simply opened my filing cabinet. Inside were copies of every tax return for the past decade. Bank statements. Property records. Investment summaries. He always joked that I was old-fashioned for keeping paper copies. I prefer the word prepared. I pulled out the closing documents from when we bought the lake property. Both our names were on the original deed. The transfer to his sole ownership had happened during mediation. Quickly. Quietly. At the time, I agreed because I wanted peace. I wanted dignity. I didn't want to drag our children through a courtroom battle. But now I had a question. Why would a man so eager to start fresh need that property so badly? Unless it wasn't fresh at all. Unless it was already furnished with someone else's future. I stood up and walked to the kitchen window. The afternoon light hit the countertops just the way it always had. Nothing in my house had changed, but everything had. My ex thought he had traded stability for passion, familiarity for excitement, history for fantasy. What he didn't realize was this: fantasy is expensive, and if any marital funds were used to build it, I had rights. I closed the filing cabinet slowly. He thought he had married his dream woman. The moment I saw her face, I realized something much more important. He hadn't left me for love. He had exposed himself, and I have always been very good at reading patterns. After I saw that wedding photo, I didn't pour a glass of wine. I poured a cup of black coffee. Because this wasn't about heartbreak. This was about clarity. When you've been married for 34 years, you learn someone's rhythms. The way they breathe when they're lying. The way they avoid eye contact when they've already made a decision. Looking back, the divorce didn't start the night he said, "I need something different." It started a year earlier. That was when he began spending more time at the lake property. "At our age, I need space," he told me. Space. It's amazing how that word can mean freedom for one person and abandonment for another. He said the drive helped him think. It was about 3 hours from our house in Dallas to Lake Travis. He started leaving Thursday afternoons and coming back late Sunday nights. At first, I encouraged it. We were both adjusting to retirement. The quiet in the house felt heavier than either of us expected. I thought maybe the lake air would clear his mind. What I didn't know was that he wasn't alone up there. The first red flag wasn't emotional. It was financial. I handle paperwork. Always have. One afternoon, I noticed a transfer from our joint account. Labeled property upgrades. $10,000. That surprised me because we hadn't discussed renovations. When I asked, he shrugged. Just updating the dock. It needed it. The dock was fine. I painted those railings myself 2 summers ago. But I let it go. 34 years of marriage trains you to choose your battles. Then came the credit card. He said he needed a separate one for consulting expenses, even though he was technically semi-retired. I didn't argue. I trusted. That's the part people don't understand about betrayal at our age. It's not dramatic. It's subtle. It hides inside ordinary conversations. One night, about 4 months before the divorce, I drove to the lake house without telling him. It wasn't suspicion. It was loneliness. I thought maybe we could surprise each other. Maybe cook dinner together like we used to. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, his truck wasn't there. But there was another car. A white sedan. Clean. New. Out of place against the cedar trees. I sat in my car for a full minute. I told myself it was a neighbor. A contractor. A friend. I walked up to the porch. The curtains were drawn. I didn't knock. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me already knew. I drove back to Dallas that night without ever stepping out of the car. And I never told him I had been there. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger. Awareness. A week later, he announced he wanted a divorce. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Now, sitting in my quiet kitchen months later, I replayed everything like an accountant reviewing an audit. The lake property renovations. The new furniture he insisted we didn't need. The sudden urgency to finalize mediation quickly. He didn't fight hard for the house in Dallas. He fought hard for the lake. That's what I should have questioned. Because love doesn't move that fast. But planning does. When we were in mediation, he pushed for a clean split. No lingering entanglements. No shared ownership. At the time, I interpreted that as kindness. Now I saw it differently. He needed freedom from paperwork. Freedom to remarry without complications. Freedom to present the lake house as a romantic beginning instead of what it really was. An overlap. I opened my laptop and searched public records for the marriage license. Filed 10 days after our divorce was finalized. 10 days. You don't plan a wedding in 10 days. You execute one. And that means deposits. Venues. Vendors. Which means money had already been spent. Marital money. I leaned back in my chair and let that settle. It wasn't jealousy I felt. For almost a year and a half. A year and a half. That meant she was there long before the divorce conversation. Carol hesitated before continuing. There were reimbursements, she said carefully. Travel expenses. Lodging. They were categorized under client development. Client development. I thanked her for telling me. I didn't gasp. I didn't curse. I wrote the words down. Travel. Lodging. Client development. After we hung up, I opened the bank statements that had just arrived. Line by line, I reviewed them. There were weekends where he had withdrawn cash near Lake Travis. Charges at furniture stores in Austin. Payments to a boutique interior design company. Interior design. For a dock repair? No. For a furnished beginning. I leaned back and closed my eyes. You see, betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's itemized. I remembered something else. 6 months before he asked for a divorce, he insisted we refinance the lake property. He said interest rates were favorable. It was a smart financial move. I signed the paperwork without question. Now I pulled up the refinance documents from my filing cabinet. There it was. A cash-out refinance. Funds deposited into our joint account. And shortly after, transferred out. In pieces small enough not to alarm me at the time. 5,000 here. 8,000 there. Enough to renovate a bedroom. Replace appliances. Buy new patio furniture. Enough to turn a weekend retreat into a honeymoon setting. The timeline was no longer blurry. It was precise. He didn't fall in love and then leave. He prepared to leave. That white sedan I saw in the driveway months ago wasn't an accident. It was staging. I walked into my living room and stood in the quiet. For 34 years, I had built a stable life. A predictable one. College tuition paid. Retirement accounts balanced. No debt except a modest mortgage. I valued security. He valued excitement. And excitement is expensive. I thought about the wedding photo again. Her hand resting confidently on his chest. His expression almost triumphant. They looked like they had won something. What they didn't realize was this. If marital funds were used to finance that lake house transformation, if he misrepresented assets during mediation, then their celebration had a paper trail. I called my attorney. Not emotional. Prepared. I have reason to believe marital funds were used improperly prior to dissolution, I said evenly. There was a pause on the other end. That's a serious claim, he replied. I know. He asked for documentation. Statements. Dates. Copies of the refinance agreement. I told him I had all of it. Because I did. That's the difference between being blindsided and being observant. I may not have confronted him at the lake house that night, but I never stopped paying attention. By the time I hung up, an appointment was scheduled for the following week. I placed the phone down gently. Outside, the Texas sun was beginning to set. The light hit the hardwood floors the same way it had for years. Nothing looked different. But everything was. This wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. He believed he had outmaneuvered me. He believed signing quickly meant closing the chapter permanently. But marriage is not just emotion. It's contract. And contracts can be reviewed. As I gathered the statements into a neat stack, I felt something unexpected. Not sadness. Not even anger. Certainty. The young woman in lace may have thought she was stepping into a finished story. But she walked into the middle of an audit. And I have always been very thorough. A week later, I walked into my attorney's office with a leather folder under my arm. Same office where we finalized the divorce. Same conference table. Different energy. Back then, I was trying to end things quietly. Preserve dignity. Protect our children from a drawn-out court battle. This time, I wasn't there to preserve anything. I was there to clarify. My attorney, Mr. Hargrove, had already reviewed the documents I emailed. He didn't waste time with small talk. You may have a case, he said. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Measured. He pointed to 3 areas of concern. First, the cash-out refinance on the lake property. Second, the transfers categorized as business development. Third, the timeline between those transfers and the wedding. If these funds were used to prepare the property for remarriage before the divorce was finalized, he explained, that could constitute misuse of marital assets. Misuse. Such a simple word for something that felt so layered. He asked me one question that stayed with me. Did he disclose any ongoing romantic relationship during mediation? No, I answered. Did he disclose that the lake house was being renovated for personal use beyond his own occupancy? No, Mr. Hargrove leaned back. In that case, we may be looking at material non-disclosure. Again, simple words, but legally significant. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply nodded. What are the next steps? I asked. He explained that we would file a motion to reopen certain financial aspects of the settlement. Not the divorce itself, just the money. If the court agreed there was probable cause, temporary freezes could be placed on contested assets, including the lake property, including joint investment transfers tied to it. I felt a small, steady shift inside my chest. Not revenge. Balance. When I got home, I didn't sit in silence. I began organizing. Tax returns by year. Mortgage statements. Property tax assessments. Photos of the lake house from before renovations. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to Lake Travis, 3 hours north. The same drive he used to take every Thursday afternoon. The cedar trees lining the highway looked exactly as they always had. The sky wide. The air dry. When I pulled into the driveway, the gate was open. New landscaping bordered the entrance. Fresh gravel. Someone had invested effort here. I didn't knock. This time, I walked straight to the dock. The railings I painted were gone, replaced with sleek metal posts. The old patio chairs we bought at a local hardware store were gone too. In their place, cream-colored outdoor furniture. Expensive. Coordinated. This wasn't a bachelor's retreat. This was a curated setting. A staged beginning. I stepped onto the dock and looked out at the water. For years, this was where we brought our children. Where we celebrated anniversaries. Where we planned retirement. Now it looked like a magazine spread. And that's when I noticed something small but important. Through the open back door, I could see framed photos inside. Not of our family. Of them. The wedding photo was already displayed in the living room. The timeline wasn't just tight. It was overlapping. I took pictures with my phone. Exterior upgrades. New furnishings. The updated dock. Not out of bitterness. Out of documentation. On my drive back to Dallas, my phone rang. It was him. I let it ring twice before answering. I heard from Hargrove's office, he said. Of course he did. His voice wasn't angry. It was cautious. You're reopening the settlement? I'm reviewing financial discrepancies, I replied calmly. There was a pause. It's over, he said. Why drag this out? Because. It wasn't over when you were moving money. But I didn't say that. I just want transparency, I answered. Another pause. Then something subtle shifted in his tone. You agreed to the terms. Yes, I said evenly. Based on the information provided at the time. Silence. He knew. That's the thing about long marriages. You can hear guilt even when it's disguised as frustration. Is this about her? He asked. No, it wasn't. It was about accounting. It's about the numbers, I said. We ended the call without yelling. Without threats. But the air had changed. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. Across the state, in that renovated lake house, they were probably unpacking wedding gifts. Laughing. Believing the past had been cleanly erased. But here's what they didn't understand. Paper doesn't erase that easily. If marital funds were used to build their beginning, then their foundation wasn't romance. It was misrepresentation. And the court doesn't care about love stories. It cares about records. I placed the printed photos from the lake house next to the bank statements. Image. Transaction. Timeline. Aligned. For 34 years, I kept our household stable. Balanced. Accountable. He mistook that steadiness for weakness. But steadiness is powerful. Because when the truth begins to surface, it doesn't rush. It builds. Quietly. Methodically. And once it's complete, it doesn't need to shout. It simply stands. And I was almost finished building mine. 3 days after he called me, my attorney filed the motion. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just paperwork submitted to the district court in Travis County. By Friday afternoon, temporary financial restrictions were in place pending review. The lake property couldn't be sold. Certain accounts couldn't be transferred. Large withdrawals would be flagged. It wasn't a victory. It was a pause button. And sometimes, that's more powerful. I didn't tell anyone. Not my daughter. Not my friends at church. Not even Carol. I went about my week the way I always do. Grocery store on Monday. Book club on Wednesday. Dinner with my sister on Thursday. But inside, something had shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was directing. Sunday evening, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't him. It was her. I almost didn't answer. But curiosity has always been one of my quieter strengths. Mrs. Whitaker, she said. Her voice sounded different from the night she complimented. My lemon chicken. Less polished. Yes, I replied. There was a brief hesitation. I think there's been some misunderstanding about the property situation. Misunderstanding. I almost smiled. I don't believe so, I said calmly. She cleared her throat. We've invested quite a bit into the house. The renovations, the furniture, the wedding reception deposit. This legal action is disruptive. Disruptive. That word again. Interesting how inconvenience feels like injustice when you're not the one who was misled. I'm reviewing financial discrepancies that occurred prior to my divorce, I said evenly. If everything was handled properly, there won't be a problem. Silence. Then something slipped into her tone. We didn't do anything wrong. We. Not he. That told me more than she intended. I didn't argue. I'm sure the court will determine that, I replied. When we hung up, I sat very still. Not because I was shaken, because I was thinking. She had used the word invested. That meant she believed this was permanent. That meant she didn't think she was temporary. Which meant he had made promises. Promises funded by what used to be ours. Later that night, he called again. His voice wasn't cautious this time. It was tight. "This is unnecessary," he said. "You're embarrassing us." Us. I folded my hands in my lap. "I'm clarifying finances," I answered. "You signed the agreement." "Yes," I said. "Based on full disclosure." He exhaled sharply. "There was no deception." "Then you have nothing to worry about." Another silence. This one longer. "You're doing this because you're hurt," he said finally. That's the part that almost made me laugh. Men often believe women act from emotion, as if spreadsheets are sentimental. "This isn't about feelings," I said quietly. "It's about documentation." We ended the call the same way we ended our marriage, without resolution. But this time, I wasn't the one walking away empty-handed. The following week, my attorney received preliminary financial responses from his side. Receipts for renovation materials. Invoices from contractors. Payments to an interior design firm. All dated before our divorce was finalized. Some even dated before mediation began. The timeline tightened. What he had framed as a fresh start was clearly under construction long before I signed anything. And here's the part that mattered most. Several payments had originated directly from the joint account tied to the refinance. Not as separate funds. Ours. I sat across from Mr. Hargrove again as he tapped the stack of papers. "This strengthens your position," he said. "Especially if intent can be demonstrated." Intent. A powerful word in a courtroom. I nodded slowly. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt vindicated. Across the state, that lake house with its polished metal dock and cream patio furniture was no longer just a honeymoon setting. It was evidence. And evidence has weight. That evening, as the Texas sky turned pink outside my kitchen window, I thought about something simple. For 34 years, I was loyal. For 34 years, I contributed equally. Time, energy, money. If he chose to rewrite the ending of our marriage, that was his decision. But he doesn't get to rewrite the accounting. Because love can end quietly. But financial truth? It leaves a record. And records don't disappear just because someone posts a wedding photo and calls it destiny. They remain, waiting to be reviewed. And I was far from finished reviewing. 2 weeks after the motion was filed, the court scheduled a preliminary hearing. Not a trial, just a review. But reviews matter, especially when money is involved. I didn't dress for revenge that morning. I wore a navy blazer, pearl earrings, low heels, the same kind of outfit I wore to parent-teacher conferences and board meetings for the nonprofit I used to volunteer with. Steady, appropriate, unshaken. When I walked into the courthouse in Travis County, I saw them before they saw me. He stood near the hallway window, arms crossed. She stood beside him. Not behind him this time. Beside him. Her confidence from that wedding photo had softened. Courtrooms have a way of removing fantasy from the air. They noticed me at the same time. He gave a tight nod. She looked uncertain. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply walked past them and into the courtroom. Inside, everything was quiet. Fluorescent lights. Wooden benches. The hum of air conditioning. This wasn't a wedding chapel. This was procedure. Our attorneys did most of the talking. Mr. Hargrove laid out the timeline clearly. Cash out refinance, transfers from joint accounts, renovations dated before mediation, marriage license filed 10 days post-divorce, no dramatics. Just sequence. Their attorney argued that the funds were legitimate business expenses, that renovations were necessary maintenance, that the remarriage timeline was coincidental. Coincidental. Interesting word when paired with receipts. The judge didn't rule that day, but she did something important. She ordered a forensic accounting review of financial activity tied to the lake property during the 12 months prior to dissolution. Forensic accounting. That's not romance language. That's microscope language. When the hearing ended, we stepped into the hallway. He approached me first. "You've made your point," he said quietly. "I haven't made anything yet," I replied. "This is going too far. Too far." I looked at him carefully. "For 34 years, I trusted you," I said evenly. "This is not too far. This is follow-up." He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. She stepped forward slightly. "We didn't mean for any of this to hurt you." I studied her face. The same face that smiled in my kitchen. The same face in lace on Lake Travis. "This isn't about hurt," I said. It's about accuracy. And that's when I saw it. A flicker. Not guilt. Fear. Because accuracy requires numbers. And numbers don't lie easily. Over the next month, the forensic accountant requested detailed documentation, invoices, bank authorizations, proof of business travel, proof of client meetings. Some of the charges were clean. Some weren't. The interior design payments? Labeled as consulting hospitality. The furniture delivery? Marked under client accommodation. But there were no clients listed. No contracts tied to those weekends. No revenue generated from those supposed business developments. Just expenses. Large ones. Paid from funds that belonged to both of us at the time. One afternoon, my attorney called with a calm but firm tone. "They're feeling pressure," he said. Apparently, his legal team had reached out about a potential settlement. Not reconciliation. Settlement. An offer to reimburse a portion of the refinance funds in exchange for withdrawing the motion. I sat quietly with that information. Partial reimbursement. A number designed to make this disappear quickly. But this wasn't about speed. It was about principle. If we proceed, my attorney explained, the court could award a larger percentage depending on findings. "I understand," I said. "And," he prompted, "I want the full review." Silence on the line. Then a quiet, approving breath. "Understood." That evening, as I watered the plants on my back porch, I thought about something simple. He believed marrying quickly would cement his new reality. That once vows were exchanged and photos posted, the past would feel closed. But marriage doesn't erase financial timelines. It just complicates them. Across the state, in that lake house, tension was likely replacing celebration. New furniture doesn't feel as comfortable when asset freezes are attached to it. Romantic docs lose some charm when they're included in legal exhibits. I didn't feel joy about that. I felt steadiness. For decades, I built a life rooted in order. He tried to build a fantasy on top of unfinished business. And now that business was being examined. Under oath. Under record. Under review. He thought he was starting over. What he didn't realize was this: you can begin a new chapter, but you cannot rewrite the ledger from the old one. And the ledger was still open. The forensic report came in on a Tuesday morning. 32 pages. No emotion. No assumptions. Just categorized transactions. I made a pot of coffee before I opened it. Not because I was nervous. Because I wanted to read every line clearly. The first section outlined the refinance. Total cash withdrawn, $148,000. Transferred in increments over 6 months. The second section cross-referenced expenditures tied to the lake property. Renovations, $62,400. Furniture and decor, $38,700. Appliances and structural updates, $21,300. Event deposits, $14,500. Event deposits. That line sat heavier than the others. When we were still legally married, deposits had already been placed for something. Not maintenance. Not business. An event. I kept reading. The accountant noted that several payments were labeled under consulting expenses, but showed no corresponding client invoices or revenue entries. In plain English, the money didn't match the story. By noon, my attorney called. "There's substantial overlap," he said. "Enough to argue intentional concealment." Intentional. That word again. It's different from oversight. Different from mistake. It implies planning. And planning changes everything. Later that week, we had a settlement conference scheduled before the judge would decide whether to move forward with a full hearing. Settlement conferences are interesting. They're polite battlegrounds. No raised voices. No dramatic objections. Just numbers sliding across a table. When I entered the room, I noticed something immediately. He looked tired. Not older. Just worn. She sat beside him again, but this time her hand wasn't confidently placed on his arm. It rested in her lap. Their attorney began. They were willing to reimburse the full refinance amount attributed to property upgrades, plus interest. In exchange, I would withdraw the claim of intentional non-disclosure. It was a strategic offer, financially generous enough to seem fair, legally protective enough to shield them from deeper scrutiny. My attorney turned to me. I had already decided. "I want acknowledgement," I said calmly. "Not an apology. Not humiliation. Acknowledgement. That the funds used to prepare the lake house for remarriage came from marital assets without full disclosure during mediation." The room went quiet. Their attorney shifted in his seat. "That language is unnecessary," he said. No. I replied evenly. It's accurate. Accuracy has weight. It forces people to sit with truth. He finally spoke directly to me. It wasn't like that, he said quietly. I looked at him the way you look at someone you once knew completely. The timeline says otherwise. Silence. She stared at the table. For the first time, the illusion cracked visibly. Not because of drama. Because of documentation. After a brief recess, their side returned with revised terms. Full reimbursement. Legal fees covered. A written statement acknowledging that marital funds were used without proper disclosure. Not poetic. Not emotional. But clear. My attorney looked at me again. I nodded. That was enough. We signed. Not divorce papers this time. Correction papers. As we stood to leave, he hesitated. I never meant for this to become this, he said. This being accountability. I believe you, I answered. And I did. I don't think he set out to destroy 34 years. I think he convinced himself he deserved a shortcut. A smoother exit. A prettier beginning. But shortcuts leave footprints. And footprints can be traced. When I stepped outside the courthouse, the Texas sun felt warmer than it had in weeks. Not because I had won something, but because balance had been restored. Across the state, that lake house was still standing. The cream patio furniture was still arranged carefully on the deck. The wedding photo probably still framed their smiling faces. But now it carried context. Not scandal. Context. Their beginning had a cost. And that cost had been repaid. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and closed the final folder. No champagne. No celebration post. Just quiet. He thought he was marrying his dream. What he didn't understand was this. Dreams built on shared money aren't private fantasies. They're joint investments. And joint investments require consent. For 34 years, I gave mine freely. This time, I required it in writing. And that made all the difference. The reimbursement hit my account on a Friday afternoon. Wire transfer. Clean. Precise. Documented. Principal. Interest. Legal fees. No delay. No negotiation at the last minute. Just numbers returning to where they should have been. I stared at the notification on my banking app for a long moment. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I was registering closure. For weeks, this had been about timelines, statements, hearings. Now it was settled. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything. I walked into my backyard and trimmed the roses. There's something grounding about tending to something that grows slowly. Unlike rushed weddings. Unlike quick divorces. That evening, he called. Not defensive this time. Not irritated. Just quiet. I saw the confirmation, he said. Yes, I replied. Another pause. I suppose this is finished now. Yes, I said again. There was something fragile in his voice. Not regret exactly, but awareness. When we bought that lake house, he began slowly. We imagined retirement there. I let him speak. That wasn't supposed to disappear. It didn't disappear, I thought. It was replaced. But I didn't say that. Things change, I answered calmly. He exhaled. I didn't think you'd fight. That sentence told me more than anything else he had said in months. He didn't think I'd fight. After 34 years of managing finances. After raising children. After building stability. He mistook grace for passivity. I didn't fight, I said evenly. I corrected. Silence again. Then, almost softly, she feels like this whole thing has overshadowed the beginning. Of course she does. Beginnings feel less magical when footnotes are attached. That's unfortunate, I replied. Not cruel, just honest. When we ended the call, I realized something important. This wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recalibration. Across the state, their life would continue. They would host dinners on that polished dock. They would sit on the cream patio furniture. They would frame new photos. But every piece of that property now existed without hidden debt to me. That matters. A few days later, I received a copy of the signed acknowledgement statement from my records. Clear language. Marital funds were used prior to dissolution without full disclosure. No dramatic admissions. Just legal truth. I placed the document inside my filing cabinet under closed. Not victory. Not scandal. Closed. The following Sunday, my daughter came over for lunch. She had heard pieces of what happened, but not details. You okay? She asked gently. I smiled. I'm balanced, I said. That's the word that kept returning to me. Balanced. Because here's the truth about betrayal at this stage of life. It doesn't destroy you unless you let confusion linger. Clarity is protection. Money returned doesn't erase disappointment, but it restores equity. Later that evening, I sat at my dining table with a notebook. For the first time in months, I wasn't reviewing old transactions. I was planning forward. Investments, travel, possibilities. For 34 years, my plans included someone else. Now they included only me, and that felt unfamiliar, but not frightening. He believed he had stepped into a dream. Perhaps he did. But dreams built on incomplete endings tend to carry tension. Mine didn't. Mine was settled. The lake house no longer felt like something taken. It felt like something audited, corrected, released. I closed my notebook and turned off the kitchen lights. For months, I had been tracing patterns backward. Now I could finally move forward without looking over my shoulder. He thought marrying quickly would secure his happiness. What he didn't understand was this. Happiness built on transparency lasts longer than happiness built on haste. And I have always preferred things that last. After the funds were returned and the acknowledgement was signed, something unexpected happened. Silence. No more calls from attorneys. No more certified mail. No more cautious voicemails. Just space. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't carrying tension. And that's when reality settled in. Not the legal kind. The personal kind. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after everything closed, I received a message from an old neighbor who still lived near the lake property. Not gossip. Just information. They've been quiet lately, she wrote. Not as many gatherings. I read it without reaction. Because this story was never about whether their marriage would succeed or fail. It was about whether mine would end cleanly. And now it had. Still, something about that message lingered. Not satisfaction. Perspective. When a relationship begins under pressure, financial review, court hearings, repayment, it doesn't feel light. It feels examined. An examination changes dynamics. Later that week, I drove to Austin for something unrelated, a small art exhibit I'd been meaning to see. On my way back to Dallas, I passed the exit toward Lake Travis. I didn't plan to turn, but I did. Not to confront. Not to inspect. Just to stand there one last time without unresolved business. The gate was closed this time. New security keypad installed. I almost smiled at that. Security often increases after instability. I didn't need to go inside. I parked across the road and looked toward the water through the trees. The house looked beautiful. Finished. Polished. Complete. But here's what I noticed. It no longer carried weight. Before, it felt like something taken from me. Then it felt like something contested. Now, it felt like something separate. I had my share returned. My name cleared. My records corrected. The lake house could belong to them fully now. Without my shadow in the paperwork. As I drove back onto the highway, I realized something simple. Closure doesn't always arrive in dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives in the absence of anxiety. That evening my son called. He had finally heard more details about what happened, not from me, but from his father. He said things got complicated. My son told me carefully. They did, I replied. Are you angry? I paused before answering. No, I said honestly. I'm informed. There's a difference. Anger burns hot and fades. Information stabilizes. My son exhaled, relieved. I just want everyone okay, he said. And that's the thing about children, even grown ones in their 30s. They don't want sides. They want peace. You don't need to fix anything, I told him. Everything is handled. And it was. A few days later, I received one final envelope from my attorney's office confirming that the case was officially closed. No further action required. I placed the letter in my filing cabinet under the same tab. Closed. Not because the story didn't matter, but because it no longer controlled anything. Across the state, life continued for him. For her. For me. But here's the quiet truth I came to understand. When someone rushes into a new beginning, hoping it will erase the complexity of an ending, they often forget one thing. Unfinished business follows. He thought marrying quickly would seal the chapter. Instead, it opened an audit. And audits don't scream. They clarify. That night, I sat on my back porch with a light blanket around my shoulders. The Texas air was cooling as autumn approached. For months, I had been focused on what was owed. Now I was thinking about what was possible. Travel I had postponed. Friends I had neglected. Projects I had set aside while supporting someone else's career. I wasn't rebuilding. I was redirecting. There's power in that. He married his dream woman. Perhaps she is exactly what he wanted. But dreams that start with oversight corrected feel different. More fragile. More aware. As for me, I no longer felt like the woman who was replaced. I felt like the woman who reviewed the ledger and closed it properly. And that distinction matters. Because when you close something with clarity, you don't look back wondering. You look forward knowing. And knowing is quieter than revenge. But it lasts longer. About 2 months after everything was officially closed, I received a letter. Not from a lawyer. From him. Handwritten. That surprised me more than anything else. After decades of emails, texts, and formal documents, a handwritten letter felt almost old-fashioned. I didn't open it immediately. I made tea first. Sat down. Let the moment settle. The envelope wasn't thick. Just a few pages. He wrote that he wanted to clear the air. That phrase made me pause. Because the air had already been cleared, in court. But I kept reading. He admitted that he had grown restless in the final years of our marriage. That he felt invisible. That he convinced himself he deserved something new. He didn't call it an affair. He called it an emotional transition. People rename things when they want to soften them. He wrote that the financial decisions happened quickly, and that he didn't fully consider how they would look in retrospect. Look, interesting word. Because this was never about appearance. It was about sequence. Near the end of the letter, he wrote something that stayed with me. I thought once we were married, everything would feel settled. But it didn't. He didn't say they were unhappy. He didn't say there were problems. He said it didn't feel settled. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. For weeks, I had sensed that something lingered on their side. Not scandal. Not chaos. Just tension. When you begin something under scrutiny, it carries memory. Even if the money is repaid. Even if the paperwork is signed. Accountability leaves an imprint. Later that week, my daughter called again. She seemed stressed, she said carefully. I asked. He had brought his new wife to a family gathering. Apparently, the atmosphere was polite but restrained. She feels judged, my daughter explained. I thought about that for a moment. Judgment and awareness are not the same thing. No one needs to judge her, I said. Everything has already been resolved. And it had. But resolution doesn't erase narrative. The story of how something begins matters. Not to the court, but to people. Across the state, at that lake house, life continued. Barbecues. Sunset dinners on the dock. Photos posted occasionally. But less frequently than before. The celebration phase had quieted. Reality had taken over. And reality is less glossy than lace dresses and chapel steps. One evening, my phone buzzed again. A short text from him. I hope one day we can look back at this without tension. I read it twice before replying. There is no tension on my end. That was the truth. I wasn't carrying resentment. I wasn't replaying betrayal. I wasn't wishing failure on them. I had been reimbursed. Acknowledged. Released. If tension remained, it wasn't mine. A few weeks later, I received one final update from my attorney. The forensic review had been officially archived. No further discrepancies found beyond what was settled. Closed completely. That word again. Closed. It's remarkable how powerful that feels after uncertainty. I sat in my living room that night, the same one where he once told me he needed something different. The furniture hadn't changed. The walls hadn't moved. But I had. For a moment, I allowed myself to reflect, not on what I lost, but on what I learned. When someone leaves quickly for a dream, they often believe speed equals certainty. But certainty isn't created by haste. It's created by stability. And stability takes time. He married his dream woman. Perhaps she is kind. Perhaps she truly loves him. That isn't my concern. What mattered was that the foundation of that dream was corrected before it hardened into something unfair. You can't build a peaceful future on unsettled ground. Not legally. Not emotionally. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized something simple. He thought the wedding would mark the end of our story. Instead, it became a footnote. Because the real ending wasn't the divorce. It wasn't the remarriage. It was the moment the ledger balanced. And once balance is restored, there's nothing left to argue about. Only space. And space, when earned properly, feels surprisingly light. By the time winter settled over Texas, everything had been quiet for nearly 3 months. No legal notices. No tense phone calls. No careful conversations through attorneys. Just ordinary life. And that's when the shift became visible. Not in court. Not on paper. In people. One Saturday afternoon, my son invited both of us to his house for our grandson's birthday. First time we would all be in the same room since everything closed. I didn't hesitate. Avoidance gives events more weight than they deserve. When I arrived, balloons were tied to the mailbox. Music floated through the open windows. Children were running through the yard with frosting on their fingers. Normal. That's what I wanted. He was already there, standing near the grill. She stood beside him, smiling, but not radiant like the wedding photo. Measured, careful. When he saw me, he gave a small nod. Polite, civil. We exchanged the kind of greeting you give an old colleague. Good to see you, he said. You too, I replied. No tension on my side. And that difference matters. During the party, I noticed something subtle. People weren't cold toward her, but they were observant. There's a difference. When beginnings are clean, people relax around them. When beginnings come with footnotes, people remain aware. She laughed at the right moments. Helped serve cake. Tried to blend into the rhythm of the family. But she was aware of the story that preceded her, and that awareness has weight. At one point, she approached me alone near the kitchen counter. I'm glad everything worked out, she said carefully. Worked out. Interesting phrase. It did, I replied calmly. She hesitated, then added, I hope you know I never wanted things to overlap. There it was. Overlap. The most honest word anyone had used so far. I understand, I said. And I did. Because here's the truth. Affairs aren't always malicious. Sometimes they're selfish. Sometimes they're convenient. Sometimes they're rationalized. But they always overlap something. And overlap creates consequence. She nodded slightly, as if relieved that I wasn't hostile. I wasn't. There's no strength in bitterness once justice has been handled. Later that afternoon, I watched him from across the yard. He looked older than he had at the courthouse. Not physically. Internally. There's a certain confidence men carry when they believe they've outmaneuvered a situation. That confidence had softened, not defeated, just recalibrated. When you are required to repay something, sign acknowledgement statements, and sit through forensic reviews, it changes the way you tell your own story. He no longer carried the narrative of a clean escape. He carried the memory of correction. As the sun began to set, I gathered my coat. He walked me to my car. For a moment, we stood quietly in the driveway. I didn't expect you to handle everything the way you did, he said. How did you expect me to handle it? I asked gently. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. Angry. Loud. I shook my head slightly. I don't need to be loud to be clear. That's something many people misunderstand. Volume isn't power. Clarity is. He looked toward the house where she stood talking to my daughter. I thought once it was settled, everything would feel simple again, he admitted. And does it? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Because when a beginning is born under pressure, legal reviews, reimbursements, acknowledgement letters, it carries history. Not scandal. History. And history doesn't disappear just because rings are exchanged. As I drove home, I felt something steady settle in my chest. Not victory. Not sadness. Completion. He married his dream woman. Perhaps she is everything he wanted. But dreams don't erase accountability. They coexist with it. And accountability reshapes confidence. For me, the story was no longer about betrayal. It wasn't about him. It wasn't even about her. It was about the moment I saw her face in that wedding photo and understood something deeper. The truth doesn't rush. It reveals itself. Quietly. Then waits for you to decide whether you'll ignore it or document it. I documented it. I corrected it. And now I could stand in the same room, at the same family table, without shrinking. Not because I won, but because I didn't disappear. And at this stage of life, that matters more than anything. It's been almost a year now since I saw that wedding photo. The one taken on the dock at Lake Travis. The one where she wore lace, and he looked victorious. The one that made everything suddenly make sense. When I think back to that moment, I don't feel the sting I expected I would carry. I feel clarity. Because that photo wasn't the beginning of my loss. It was the beginning of my understanding. People often assume the most painful moment in a story like this is the divorce, or the remarriage, or the court hearing. But for me, the most powerful moment was quieter than all of that. It was the second I zoomed in on that picture and recognized her face. Not because I felt replaced, but because I realized I had been underestimated. He thought speed would protect him. He thought once vows were exchanged and congratulations poured in, the past would dissolve neatly. He believed that if something looked complete, it must be complete. But life doesn't work that way. Contracts don't work that way. Truth certainly doesn't work that way. That wedding photo didn't break me. It activated me. And that difference changed everything. A few weeks ago, I did something small but symbolic. I refinished my dining table. The same one where we signed birthday cards for our children. The same one where I reviewed bank statements during those long nights. The same one where I sat with coffee reading the forensic report. I sanded it down, removed the scratches, restained it in a slightly deeper shade. Not because it was damaged beyond repair, but because it was ready for a new chapter. There's something poetic about restoration. You don't throw everything away. You renew what's worth keeping. That's what this year taught me. Marriage may have ended, but my steadiness didn't. Trust may have been shaken, but my clarity strengthened. Money was moved, but it was returned. And here's the part that matters most. I didn't have to scream to be heard. I didn't have to shame anyone to feel vindicated. I didn't have to collapse in order to prove I had been hurt. I simply followed the paper trail. And the paper trail told the truth. Sometimes people ask me now, gently, do you regret not fighting harder to save the marriage? I don't. Because you can't save something that has already been emotionally relocated. And you shouldn't beg for a seat at a table where someone else is already setting the place settings. What you can do is protect your dignity. And dignity doesn't shout. It stands. He married his dream woman. Maybe she is his dream. Maybe she brings him laughter and light. I don't need to diminish that to feel whole. Because my wholeness doesn't depend on his choices anymore. What I know is this. Their beginning was audited, corrected, balanced, and mine was rebuilt on certainty. The lake house no longer feels like a symbol of betrayal. It feels like a case study. A reminder that excitement can cloud judgment. That secrecy has cost. That haste leaves footprints. And that even after 34 years, you are never too old to demand transparency. Sometimes I sit on my back porch at dusk and think about the version of myself from that day. The woman staring at her phone, seeing lace and smiles and polished dock railings. She could have spiraled. She could have called him in tears. She could have deleted the photo and pretended not to care. Instead, she zoomed in. She noticed details. She opened a filing cabinet. She chose documentation over drama. And that choice protected her. That choice protected me. If there's anything I hope you take from my story, it's this. Betrayal doesn't define you. Your response does. You don't need revenge to feel restored. You need clarity. You need balance. You need to know that if something was taken unfairly, you have the right to ask questions. Calmly, confidently, completely. When I saw her face, I thought I was witnessing the end of something. In truth, I was witnessing exposure. And exposure is uncomfortable at first, but it leads to alignment. He believed he was marrying his dream. What he actually married was accountability. And as for me, I didn't lose a husband that day. I gained confirmation of who I have always been. Steady, observant, unshakable when it matters. The story didn't end at the altar. It ended at the ledger. Balanced, closed, and finally, light.